Next up, as I mentioned to open the show, we're introducing a new segment this week. Market Journal's Bill Dodd is here with a roundup of some of the top stories that he's watching this week. Bill, what have you got for us today?
We all know Nebraska is a top contender when it comes to corn and beef, but this year, however, has been an interesting one for wheat and what to expect from the crop. With unseasonably low temperatures to begin the month of May, some wheat producers have had concern over potential freeze injury to their crop. As of April 28th, the National Agricultural Statistics Service reported the conditions of Nebraska's winter wheat crop to be 3% excellent, 65% good, 28% fair, 3% poor, and 1% very poor. Extension educator Karen DeBoer tells us that through experience, we know that injury does not always occur at the air temperature listed. Injury is greatly influenced by duration of low temperature and growth stages of the wheat. Furthermore, she explains the best ways to assess any damage sustained by freezing, as well as the microclimate factors that could affect your crop.
You need to wait at least 5 days for any symptoms to show up after you have a freeze. And we're talking about, like this time, if it gets down to about 28 degrees for a couple hours overnight, it can damage the wheat. And you need to look for nodes that are discolored. As the wheat develops, depending on what stage it was when the freeze occurred, as it develops, that growing point or the head that comes out of the plant will show some damage. It may eventually turn white, or depending on when the freeze occurred, the wheat itself could be sterile because it was flowering at the time of the freeze. So those are some things that you can look for. And when you're talking about freeze injury, there's a lot of things that can influence whether or not the crop is damaged. One of them has to do with the amount of soil moisture that's present. If you have drier soils, they tend to warm up and cool down faster than wetter soils. So if your soil conditions are dry, the chances of injuring the wheat are a little bit greater than they are if it's wet. So that'd be one example of a microclimate.
If the wheat is flowering or just past the flowering stage when frost hits, wheat damage is not easily identified. The exposed anthers are the most susceptible to the freeze. In general, it's only possible to evaluate seed fill by dissecting heads 10 to 14 days after a frost. If there are many blank glooms or kernels are not developing, this is usually a good indication of damage. And with a possible downturn in the winter wheat market and hay shortage in several parts of Nebraska, now could be a good time for producers to evaluate whether or not they would be better off selling their wheat as forage or grain. Current market value of hay is ranging from $80 to $150 per ton. In some parts of the state, hay is in short supply. Harvested feed costs at current hay prices are ranging from $1.50 to $2.25 per cow-calf pair per day. 1 acre of wheat in May and early June with adequate moisture could provide 45 days or more of grazing for 1 cow-calf pair. At $2 per day, this is a value of $90 per acre. For some producers, the option to graze out wheat may net more value to them per acre than harvesting it for grain. Now, this is especially true if recent weather conditions or disease have damaged wheat and will reduce expected grain yields. As Nebraska Extension educator Aaron Berger explains, there are a few things that wheat producers should take into account first.
So obviously it just depends on what the forage situation you have in terms of quality or grain. So, really the cost of hay right now, if we were to feed a cow-calf pair, similar quality hay, we're going to be spending around over $2, $2.50 a day. So when we look at the value of that grazing versus the alternative of feeding them a similar quality hay, it starts to become a situation where that wheat does have significant value for grazing. So I think we need to first evaluate what would be the impact of that decision in terms of impact on insurance. So I really encourage producers who are considering either grazing their wheat, grazing it out versus taking it to grain or putting it up for hay or silage, to go visit with their crop insurance agent first, understanding what would be the impact to them of that decision. Really then it starts to come down to a partial budget, looking at what's the value of either grazing that or harvesting it for forage versus what they think they would net with taking it to grain. So we need to think about the whole system, need to think about the implications of either grazing or harvesting as forage, also in their crop rotation, and really put together what their options are so they can evaluate that and make the best decision. So for folks that have cattle in a dry lot scenario right now, muddy conditions are going to be the day. And so that's the situation they have. If they have the opportunity to get those cattle out on some wheat pasture, get those cattle spread out, get them in a clean, drier environment than they are currently, and also having those cattle graze a high quality forage, it can be a win-win in a number of scenarios. The other thing I see is we're tending to see a delay in terms of pasture green up, in terms of pasture growth being ready for grazing. And so being able to delay turnout is going to allow that pasture to get some additional growth on it before we go to grazing, which will benefit the overall productivity of that pasture for the season as a whole.
For young growing cattle, wheat hay should be cut in the boot stage or as soon as possible after heading to ensure good protein and energy content as well as palatability. If mature dry beef cows are to be fed, harvest can be delayed a little longer to increase yield, but nutritional value and palatability will be sacrificed. One possible advantage to grazing wheat or harvesting it early in the boot stage for hay could also open up a window of opportunity to plant a summer annual forage in the wheat stubble as a second crop if moisture conditions are present. And Troy, that's what I'm watching this week, and I'll send it back to you.